series on the building blocks of virtualization. Today we're really excited here at CentriNet to have Liquidware Labs founder and COO Tyler T-Rex Rohrer. He'll be presenting on virtualization assessments. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, so if you have any questions, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We are also recording today's webinar, and it should be available on our website tomorrow morning, along with all of the rest of the recordings from earlier sessions in the series. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, Tyler.
Great. Well, thank you for having me here this afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Tyler T-Rex Rohrer, the founder and chief operating officer here at Liquidware Labs. And so what I'm going to be focused on today is desktop strategies, and a large component of how we look at the world here at Liquidware Labs revolves around a very logical life cycle of assessment, migration, and monitoring. There are a number of new technologies that are becoming very and probably increasingly popular out there in the popular press. And so we think it's our job, together with CentriNet, to dispel some of the myths and arm you folks with processes and tools to help make that journey a little more successful. So with that, I think I'll start with a theme. The theme that I like to start with is that at a very high level, I believe it's most of our job, if we're in charge of administrating desktop populations, to kind of do the following. I call this the desktop dilemma, which is it's our job to create these reliable computer systems out of all of these intrinsically unreliable parts, and actually include end users in that equation, because oftentimes they are abusive, volatile, and very unpredictable in their activities. And yet we're charged with presenting them with a stable workspace so they can do the job that we pay them to do. We're also asked, by the way, to present these workspaces to these end users, using as few possible natural resources as we can, so to keep an eye on our budgets. And we're primarily giving people stuff, time, and money to accomplish that. So today we're going to explore some different ways to perhaps architect Desktop 2.0, and really the process that we like to think about as we go through this exploration. So if I look at a typical company, and by all means this is not meant to be an exact representation of your organization perhaps, but if I look at a typical company, oftentimes there are a ton of different users. And not only that, I've got different users doing different things. I've got accounting and sales and legal and maybe manufacturing. And because of that, typically, I provision for them different systems. This user gets a laptop, that user gets an iPad, this user gets a Blade PC perhaps, maybe this user gets a terminal server session. And what ends up happening is that what I find is that standard gold image that I wanted to have, that one pristine image that everyone could share, really is anything but. I have many different versions of that image that float around my company. Each one of those versions is built for a different system and has the applications in it so that the different users and the different user groups can do their job. When I add to that this unpredictable and volatile usage by end users, I start to see problems starting to add up. Now, I think for the last 20 years or so, we've been very well trained to provision and prepare for a worst-case scenario. What I mean by that is I'll give the user all the apps that they might double-click on because they might use them, or I'll give the user 2 gigs of RAM because they might need it. And so we've had to account for and purchase and manage for a worst-case scenario that typically doesn't come true. I mean, every now and then a user might consume or use all of the apps or things that we put on their desktop, but it's usually not the case. And we add to that the fact that most of these devices, at least for the last 20 years or so, are for the most part, commodity class. They're not enterprise class, meaning they don't have, 2 power supplies and backup hard drives and RAID on board and these types of things, and they just plain old break. And when they do break, it's often painful, time-consuming, and I think a management headache, not to mention just the time lag that's involved in perhaps loss of user productivity, for us to get a new thing to them. I order up a new laptop or a new desktop, I get it in, I image it, I test it, I roll it out to the end user, and then they start breaking it all over again. Now, the other interesting thing is that when I think about fault tolerance and desktop or data recovery or disaster recovery, maybe maybe disaster avoidance is the right term to use, there's not a whole lot of that built into the way we do desktop computing today, right? And so when I think about, half of the intellectual property of most companies lives on the hard drives of its end users, well, that's a pretty dangerous place for it to be, sitting out there at 5,400 RPM, typically not being backed up every hour. And when it does break, I can definitely calculate that loss of productivity for that end user. And that's a big challenge. Not to mention the fact that, the security risks of having data on endpoints is somewhat intolerable for a lot of organizations. As a matter of fact, most of the desktop virtualization projects that we see these days around the country tend to have a very real component of the initiative driven by security, the interest in getting stuff off of endpoints and into the data center where we can back it up, where we can replicate it, where we can secure who and when and how it's accessed, etc. And perhaps maybe the bottom line is that to fix a PC, most of the time, I have to go to that PC. Well, these are things that we want to change or might be able to be changed with, kind of VDI or Desktop 2.0 or even this notion of cloud computing, which we can talk about a little bit here. So if I looked at a typical PC, it's actually not all that complex. I've got the profile of that user. It's kind of the customization, the definition of the workspace that they've set up. It's their browsing history and their favorites and their Internet Explorer, and it's their application settings and their drive maps and their printer maps and their auto signatures and maybe their picture of themselves and their son on a fishing trip or something like that. And then I've got applications underneath that. These are the tools really that the user uses to do the job that we pay them to do. And the work product, the content they either consume or create, is the data. Now, of course, all of that lives on top of an operating system, and all of that lives on top of x86 hardware, typically with local storage. And this design has actually been fairly resilient for the last 20 years, but the problem has been that if one of those elements fails, the whole system fails for the most part. If I lose hardware, doesn't matter what operating system or applications or data or profile I have, that user's in a non-productive state until I recover. My applications aren't working, or if data is corrupted, or if my profile is lost, or I want to move around from device to device to device, that becomes a real big challenge. But if I started taking this whole thing apart, I actually end up with a pretty unique ability to put it back together in kind of some new and different ways. And really, when I talk about desktop virtualization, that's basically what we do. The first thing is I want to take that user's profile, right, and I want to get it off of that machine as a one-to-one relationship. I want that profile to live in a data somewhere, and I'm not saying this is roaming profiles. I'm not saying that at all. As a matter of fact, I think there's some really interesting technologies that are out there today that allow us to separate the user's profile, their settings, their preferences from that underlying machine and be able to present it back into an environment in a new and different way. The next thing I definitely want to focus on is I want to remove data. I don't want data to live on endpoints anymore. I want data to live in data centers. And we've all definitely tried this, with our mapping of shared drives and our attempts to lock down users' desktops so that almost everything can be saved to a network location. I mean, it happens sometimes, not all the time. We think that there's a way for it to happen perhaps all the time. And the next thing I want to remove from that stack, if it's a problem, is I'd like to remove applications. No longer do I want to think about applications as statically installed components of a desktop. I want to think of applications as something that can be presented, to a desktop environment. And the good news is this is really nothing new. I mean, this is what Citrix has been doing successfully for, 12 years. You could argue even longer than that. This notion of finding a new and different and more elegant way to present applications into a workspace than necessarily installing them. And the cool thing is that what I'm left with when I take away data and I take away profile and I take away my apps is I'm left with an operating system and some hardware. And that's what folks have been virtualizing for the past 10 years when we talk about server virtualization. And so the notion of desktop virtualization is, well, let's take that and let's apply it to desktops. Let's stand up virtual machines on top of a hypervisor of choice. They're going to live on hosts. All of that's going to be connected to shared storage. I'm going to view or connect into those desktops using some remote slave protocol like ICA, which we've known and loved and been working with for years. And I'm going to be able to then give access to that virtual machine